Hello again, time travelers, and welcome to the Adventure Box Podcast. This is the podcast where you gallop across history on an energetic horse of curiosity. That's right, my name is Zach Edwards, and today we're marching straight towards one of the most explosive and divisive, talk about an event that is all throughout history. Like every country should talk about this because the American country, the Americas, was so important during the like 1800s, and America, the United States, was one of the biggest, fastest growing nation of the time. And all of a sudden it had what was called a civil war. Now, a civil war is not like any other war. Most wars are between like France and Britain, or the United States and Britain. It's hardly ever, except in a civil war, inside the country against its own people, which is why it's called a civil war. It's the people of the nation fighting against each other for all different reasons, whether it's like slavery or states' rights, or a dictator that comes into a country and tries to take over, and people try to overturn him. So today we always talk about 3 to 4 things. Today it's 3 things. First off, we'll talk about how America got to the edge of war for the first time in the first place. How did it all happen? Second, we'll talk about why one little election, this happened in 1860, made half the country basically pack their bags. And then the third thing is how it all began with a single cannonball fired at a fort in South Carolina. It's dramatic, it's tense, and it's also sometimes, oftentimes during this war, very tragic. But don't worry, we'll all have some laughs along the way, and because even history needs a little bit of comic relief, right? So saddle up your Union blue and grab your Confederate gray. This is a story of how the United States nearly stopped being united, and actually basically would have fallen apart if it had happened. So, but before we get to all of that, we're going back. Let's go way back. This is around the late 1800s, so 1860 or so. We're not talking about the Civil War yet. We're talking about what led up to the Civil War. So let's begin with the basics. What led to this Civil War? Well, that answer is very complicated. It's very complicated because there's a lot of things to talk about. But it's also very simple. It's like a family argument that goes unresolved for a very long time. Except the stakes are millions of lives and souls of an entire nation. Like all the United States was pinning on this battle, this war. So here are 5 friction points that we will talk about. Now, there wasn't just one. It was not just about slavery, though that is the major reason for the Civil War. That was not the only one, but it was the big one. So the South had built its economy on enslaved labor, especially on cotton plantations. The North, well, it wasn't mostly, they had mostly moved away from slavery, and it was filled with what's called abolitionists. Now, these are people that basically say slavery is evil, we need to get rid of it, and we're willing to do anything. They were activists to get rid of slavery. It was also filled with newspapers, which basically went for the northern thought process. So the North wanted the abolishment of slavery. Then that's what the newspapers were going to write about, because they sold most of the papers up in the North. They did also send it to the South, or the South bought those newspapers, but the North didn't really care as much about the South and what they thought. When it came to the newspapers, they just said we needed to say it, and say it directly. And that's what they did. There was also fiery sermons from all the churches. Now, here's an interesting thing. You could be one church in the North and have the same church down in the South. Now, they didn't have different leaders, but basically the teachings are supposed to be the same if they're in the same denomination. the same religion. Now, there were fiery sermons calling out slavery as a moral evil up in the north. But down in the south, it was a little bit different. It was skirting around that topic and such. So we won't go too much into it, but that's basically what it is. It was two sides of a coin talking about the same coin, but from two different sides. On one side, it's an economic right. On the other side, it's a human wrong. And it's not an argument with an easy middle ground. It's the same coin, slavery, but two different directions that they're looking at it. So that is number one. That's the topic number one that was the most fiery during this before the Civil War. The second one was interesting. This one was called sectionalism. Now, people didn't say, I'm an American. They said, I'm a Virginian. I'm a Massachusetts. I'm from Massachusetts. Not Massachusetts. Massachusettsian. Something like that. Okay, so the country was split culturally. There was the North, then there was the South. But there was also the urban and the rural. Urban being like in the city, rural being around the city. They did not like to mix. Interesting enough, because there's so many migrants coming in, people were moving out of the city because there was no work in the city. You had cheap labor coming in from Europe and from other places. They came into, like, say, New York. And then all of a sudden, all those people that were working there and were getting a good wage, all of a sudden their wages dropped because they could get easier work, easier laborers to come in and take out their place. So a lot of those people that were there before just said, you know what, I'm done. And they moved out rural. They moved away from the cities. And they moved way away from the cities, especially as they moved west. Now, you also had the industrial versus the agricultural. As you know, industrial is mostly in the cities, not all, but mostly in the cities. So you had factories. Factories were industrial. They built things. While the agricultural side, they grew things. You couldn't grow things in the city. You had to grow it out in the rural. So in the farmlands. And again, as the cities grew, they took over those farmlands. I mean, we see it every day. In a lot of small cities, their farmlands being bought up closer to the city, and it's being bought up because more people are moving out there, and they're getting more money for that land that's being sold. So they go further out. Now, what happens with the agriculture? All of a sudden, you're taking over all that land for new houses, new factories. You have to move that farming even further out. So people are losing their generations of agriculture and farming. So this was also a big boiling point for the Civil War. They might have been basically on the same map, but they were living in different worlds. Okay, number 3, states' rights. Oh yes, this is also a really big one because this also goes back to slavery. The phrase that shows up in every 8th grade history book. Now, the South, the southern states believed that they had the right to govern themselves. Even more than just about slavery, it was about everything. The northern and southern states, each state thought they should be able to control everything that happens in the states. The North believed in a strong federal government, mostly. It's not all that's not all completely true. It was a very big mix up in the North, but in the South did not like that people were bringing up slavery and the possibility of getting rid of it. So they said we should have all rights. So you had the very, very don't want the government in my business. And you had the Northerns that said, we will take some and we don't want the others. But that's really hard to do because if you start letting in the government, they're going to take over a lot more than you want them to. So, yeah, let's just say that that's basically how it went. 4th one. Now, this is interesting. An economic difference. So the North had factories. They had railroad. They had industry. They were the biggest and best with the industrial industry. The South was different. They were growing, again, the agriculture. We've talked about that, agriculture versus industrial. They were growing cotton and tobacco, and also they were enslaving labor. They were selling slaves, and that made a lot of money, not just for the people selling them, but also for the government. You know, taxes. Yeah, they take taxes from anywhere they can get them. So also, different money equals different priorities. And also, different money as in different income. They're getting money from different places. Creates different priorities. And this created major tensions in what's called the Congress. Remember, you have the House and you have the Senate inside the government. Now that's the legislative branch. And then you have the executive, which is the president. And you have the Supreme Court, or the judicial branch. That's all the judges, all the courts. So 3 separate branches of the government. And all these people, again, the representatives for each state, going together and saying, hey, we need to agree on something. It was very difficult because they didn't agree on anything between the North and the South. There's so many differences, but they were able to compromise. So there's a 5th thing. So that was number 4, economic differences. 5, this is the key political events that poured gasoline on the fire. Okay, first you have the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Okay, this is important because Missouri entered the country as a slave state. Now Maine, they created out of Massachusetts, and they made that a free state. So you had 1 free state, 1 slave state. The line was drawn at the 36°30 latitude. You know, latitude is the one that spins around horizontally on the map. That's basically where you are depending on the equator, the equator. So we're 36 degrees above and 30 feet. Everyone agreed that that's the line. All the states below that point, they had to have slaves. All those above the point, no slaves. Now this is interesting too, because what if the state did not want slavery? You gotta think that. What would happen if the state did not want slavery? I guess they never really got to that point, because every state in the South wanted slavery. Everyone in the North didn't want slavery. I guess it's just how they started growing up and pushing information. So, spoiler, did everyone agree to be civil? Don't think so. That was compromise number 1, Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Compromise of 1850, this is when California came in as a free state. Now remember, California is very long, and the line goes right through it. It was a new territory. It gets to decide whether it was a free state or a slave state. That's basically what the compromise was. You get to choose, states. You don't have to worry about this line. You choose. But the Fugitive Slave Act was also part of this, and that's when if a slave escaped from the South and came up to the North, that if they were caught, they were sent back. And man, would they be brutally, there were brutal consequences for that, even deadly consequences sometimes. So, that's why it was so hard, this compromise, the 1850 compromise, allowing states to choose if they want to be free or slaved, but also allowing for the Fugitive Slave Act. So, which one would you choose? I know which one would you choose, because you've been taught that slavery is evil for generations. But back then, it was very gray, we'll say. So it wasn't black, it wasn't white, it was gray to them. Okay, the next compromise, 4 years later. 4 years later, we had the Kansas and Nebraska Act. Now, this one says, let the people in Kansas and Nebraska vote on slavery. Sounds fair, right? Wrong. It led to what we call the Bleeding Kansas, where people literally beat each other with canes in Congress and killed each other with guns and did all types of other things. The settlers started shooting each other over how to vote as well. So this is why slavery was one of the major parts of the Civil War, but it was not the only part of the Civil War. Now, this whole thing is like a political game of Jenga. You know, where you stack up all those blocks and you try to pull one block out, one block out, one block out without the whole thing tipping over. And with every move, the tower gets more wobblier. So with every compromise or every law that's passed, that tower is just about to fall. So, what actually made it fall? I'll tell you what happened, made it fall. Okay. Now let's talk about an election that basically shook the nation. 1860. Okay, there were 4 candidates, not just 2. There were 4 candidates, but truthfully, there was basically only 2 real parties. There was a third party that basically came in and said, hey, we want to do it. We want to be part of this. But it wasn't that strong. So we basically still came down to two. But it was one of them that broke in half. We had the Northern Democrats and we had the Southern Democrats. Okay, so Abraham Lincoln was the first president or first candidate to be president as a Republican. This was the Republican Party had just been created. It was anti-slavery, and that's one of the major things that they wrote on. They were all against slavery. That was the biggest part about them. Now, there was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was a Northern Democrat. He actually lived up in the North. He was fairly moderate, but he did not want to get rid of slavery. Why? Because he was a Democrat. The Democrats wanted slavery down in the South because they elected one of their candidates. Their candidate was a Southern Democrat by the name of John C. Breckinridge. Now, Breckinridge was pro-slavery completely and for the whole country. So you had anti-slavery, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, who's said states should have the right to decide, and you had Breckinridge, who was pro-slavery everywhere that they want. You can't take away slavery, and anyone that wants slavery, they can have slavery. And then you had the Constitutional Union Party. Now, the Constitutional Union Party, his name, the candidate, was John Bell. He said, this is basically what he stood on, is, can't we all just get along? Sorry, dude. Doesn't exactly work. When something's so hot in a topic, being slavery or pro-slavery and anti-slavery, yeah, you might try to get along, but if that's the major issue of the whole election, yeah, it's going to be very hard. And so here's an interesting thing. I could go into what the results were, but before I do that, and you're going to get a lot more information in the text, but here's the thing. This one is so important to learn about because Lincoln, he was a Northerner. You know that. Down in the South, there were newspapers. There were elections down in the South, right? Not one of the states in the South allowed Abraham Lincoln to be on their ballots. So who do you think they voted for? Probably John Bell? Can't we get along? No, not really. It was most likely John C. Breckinridge or Stephen Douglas. Now, the reason why this is significant is if half the country's already voting for one party, 100%, because there's no Republican down there, well, that's 100%, plus, or that's 50% of the country, plus whatever they get in the North. So it'd be 51% or 59% or 60%, because they got whatever you got in the South and anything you got up in the North. So that just seems a little underhanded or a little bit weighted. But here's the thing. Remember, there's the Southern Democrats, there's Northern Democrats. You got John C. Breckinridge, who got the support of the Southern Democrats, but not all. Stephen Douglas also received some of those as well, as a Northern Democrat. Okay, so the Democrat Party, even though it took over 50% plus whatever came up in the North, split. Let's just say they had 60%. Okay, 60% went to the Democrats, one of the two. So if you had 30 and 30, that still left 40% for Abraham Lincoln. Because John Bell, he might have been in the... It's like every election happens right now. If you look at an election, you're going to see Republican, Democrat. But if you look at the election ballot, you're going to see 5 to 10 other parties. And they're all small. So people like to say that we're a two-party system, and it was so much better back in when the founders found it, but it wasn't. It was a two-party system the whole time we've been in this country. So two parties have basically run it. Now, different parties. It wasn't always Republicans and Democrats. There was the Democratic Republicans. That's right. They were basically the same party. Then there was the Federalists. And then there were the Whigs. And yeah, a few others. So in the end, even though everything was against Abraham Lincoln from winning, because of that split ticket of the Democrats, the Republican won. Lincoln wins without a single election vote, in the South. That's a mic drop. That is like, boom, it should not have happened. And whoa, that is way unheard of at the time. Okay, so because of this, to Southern leaders, Lincoln wasn't just a president. He was a threat to their own way of life. An anti-slavery Northerner who might just abolish slavery altogether. Now, Lincoln was a little bit smarter than that. He did not go for full on to no more slavery, because he knew he had to be able to get votes from the South. But here's the thing. Here's the big issue. So the president before him, do you remember who that was? That's right, James Buchanan. James was worthless. Nearly worthless as a president, because the Southerners started to break off even before the election. But come that election, they really started to break off. And you know what? Lincoln could not become president fast enough. But his inauguration wasn't until, I think it was May of the following year. So because of the Southerner leaders thinking that Abraham Lincoln was a threat, December 20th, 1860, South Carolina said, that's it, we're out, and left the Union. What? Yeah, one of the original 13 colonies, gone. Within months, you had Mississippi, you had Florida, you had Alabama, you had Georgia, you had Louisiana, and Texas wasn't Texas at the time. Well, it was Texas at the time. It was a state. So you had Texas as well. All of them, vamoosed. They left the Union. By February 1861, they formed their own government called the Confederate States of America and elected unanimously Jefferson Davis as president. That's like a national divorce, but with cannonballs instead of courtrooms. Lincoln isn't even inaugurated yet at this point, and the country is already in pieces. The president before him, who was still in power until Lincoln took over, Buchanan, was completely worthless, did not do anything. So, what happened from when they became the Confederate States until the first shot was fired? And we're going to talk about that in just a second. Well, this is very interesting. So, you think about it, the United States has a fairly well organized military at this time. Not like we have now, but fairly well organized. So what did they do? Well, before the Civil War, they had shipbuilding properties all along the coast. They had different forts all throughout the North and the South. They had artillery in both areas. They had everything and anything military on both sides. So what did the South do? They automatically started taking those over. Well, you start taking those over, well, the North is going to lose a lot of its power. And it's going to lose its ability to defend itself and attack if needed. Also, the South took over some of the shipyards that were in the South. Most of the shipyards were in the South. Took over a lot of the ships that were in the South. Took over a lot of the forts that were in the South. All until one fort. One fort. Now, they started taking those other forts over. No fighting. The president would not do anything. Buchanan would not do a single thing. So let's fast forward to April 1861. What happened in April 1861? Well, you probably guessed it. A very tiny island. Well, okay, maybe you didn't guess it. But I guess you guessed that the war started then? Yeah. But you have to understand how it happened and why it happened. A very tiny island. Actually, I got a picture on a map. Let me show you this picture on the map. This tiny, tiny, tiny island right there. That's where it all began. It's in the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, in Charleston Harbor. Let me zoom out so you can see a little bit more. There you go. And yeah, there you go. South Carolina. Georgia starts around right here. So South Carolina, that's a major city for them, right there, Charleston. That's a major fort right there. This is in the middle of this harbor, and no Confederate ships could get in or out as long as that fort was right there. And also they had batteries and other forts on the side, on the coast. So why was it significant? They needed to take that out in order to move supplies in and out of Charleston, which is a major, major hub. So the Confederates said, get out! Get out of Fort Sumter! We're not going to tell you twice. Okay, maybe we'll tell you twice, but we're not going to tell you a third time. Okay, maybe we'll tell you a third time. But we're done now. Lincoln says, I'm just sending food. Send a ship down there. The Confederates said, well, we'll bring the boom. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12th, so I guess it was March when Lincoln was inaugurated. But he had to wait 5 months between when he was elected and when he was put into office. And during that time, the South basically broke off. So now going back to Fort Sumter. Okay, it was, again, 4:30 a.m. You know, most of you guys are still asleep, right? Well, not me, but you guys. So the Confederates forced open fire and had 34 hours of firing on this fort before they finally surrendered. Some of these forts that they were attacking basically said, we're done. We have to split off. Luckily enough, no one died during this battle. So even though you had cannonballs firing for 34 hours, no one died. That's actually quite amazing. But because of it, it was game on. So Lincoln, now officially president, called for 75,000 volunteers to crush the rebellion. And the response? Massive. People signed up in droves, which means there's a lot of people all signing up from the North to become part of the army, the military. And actually, it wasn't just the army. Army was on land. You also had the Navy. Lots of people signing up. They think the war would be over in about 90 days. That's what they thought. They thought they could get in there, show power, and it'd be done. Spoiler alert, it's going to take about 4 years and leave 620,000 people dead. That's right. They wanted 75,000 volunteers, and in the end, 620,000 people died. 90 days? It actually took 4 years. So yeah, little spoiler alert there. After Lincoln's call, though, more southern states started to join the Confederacy. You had Virginia. Remember, Washington, D.C. is just above Virginia. It's right outside of Virginia. You also had Arkansas, North Carolina, and also Tennessee. All those started to leave the United States as well and became a Confederate state. Suddenly, it's North versus South. Literally, northern states, free states, versus southern states, slave states. Industrial versus agriculture. Those with the railroads and supports and things like that versus those in agriculture having the food, but not much less. It pinned brother versus brother, father against son, factories versus fields, and freedom versus slavery. And either side would not back down. So this is when it really starts to heat up. This is why this part is so important. It's what came to be the Civil War, before the Civil War started. So what happened? Let's just recap this. What happened from the road to war to actual starting war? So the Civil War didn't come out of nowhere. It was decades in the making. All those compromises, all those changes, even all the way back to the Constitution being written, slavery, states' rights, all these things were part of the mix. Though compromises they also had court rulings, they had speeches, and they had silent stares across the congressional aisles. Yeah, people just staring you down. Yeah, I've been in a lot of those. Yeah, duels and such. Yeah, there was actually a lot of duels during that time. Yeah, a lot of people dying on both sides. But when diplomacy failed, mainly because Buchanan wouldn't do a squat, he didn't do anything. Fort Sumter and their cannon fire marked a moment when talks turned to war, and that's basically what happened. After Fort Sumter, it was full out war. We had recruits coming in, and it's a heavy history. So the next 4 weeks will be very heavy, but it matters because if we understand what divides us now, or sorry, divided us then, maybe it'll better prepare us to unite us today. That's why it's so important. We actually need to understand what tore people apart and how we keep it going. So, until Wednesday, thanks for riding through the storm with me on this Adventure Box podcast day. I'm Zach Edwards, your guide through battles, through ballots, through banana republics, basically. We'll get more into that later on. So, reminding you that history is not just about who won, it's about why it happened, who started it, where did it come from. All these different things are essential to understand so we don't repeat it. That's right. History might not repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. That's the quote. So next time we will march into the first battles of the Civil War. We will meet some of the great generals of the time with big old beards and huge egos. That's right. Find out why everyone thought that it'd be over by Christmas. And yet, sadly enough, 4 years later, 620,000 people dead on the battlefield. That basically can destroy a small country. Well, we'll talk about that more on Wednesday. Have a great day. Hope you enjoy this. Please leave a review down below or a question. Love to hear what you think. Thanks so much and have a great day. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow actually. Take care. Bye.